Hi everyone. I was just waiting for people to filter into the event there, but I think that looks like we've got most people in and others can join as and when. So, welcome to IPPR and to this event about the truth about modern slavery. It's great to see so many of you on the call. I'm Caris Roberts, I'm Executive Director here at IPPR, and really excited for this event today. We're here to mark the launch of a new book by Emily Kenway, The Truth About Modern Slavery. And we've got with us an excellent panel to discuss that. So with us today we have Emily herself. She's the writer and author of The Truth About Modern Slavery, and she's former advisor to the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner. We also have Alex Norris MP, who is the Labour and Cooperative MP for Nottingham North, and also a shadow minister. We have Peter Olayiwola, who is a postgraduate research student at the University of Nottingham, and we've got our very own Lucy Mort, who is a research fellow at IPPR working on migration and integration. So really thrilled to have all of these people with us here today. We'll be talking about modern slavery, as I said, and about Emily's book, and I'm going to ask Emily to make some opening remarks in just a moment to introduce some of the themes of this book. I think what I found particularly interesting about Emily's work is the idea of modern slavery and how that operates as a political story, and in particular how that story can sometimes obscure what is actually going on in terms of the harms of the hostile environment towards migrants, and how our economy functions and how our labour market functions more broadly than just looking at a particularly narrow set. So very excited to hear her say more about that. We will have lots of time for questions today. So what I'd ask is that as you're thinking about your questions through the session, if you could put those in the Q&A function, and that will allow me to see them and to put them to our panelists. You can also go on the Q&A function and vote for which questions you'd like to be asked, so you can get them kind of drawn further up the attention list. But we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. The other housekeeping that I must remember is that if you order the book through Pluto Press, you can get a whopping 30% off with the code IPPR30. So the team will just put that in the chat for you to see now, I think. And do tweet along to the event. So we've got a hashtag IPPR webinar, and you can also see the handles of all of our speakers today who are on Twitter, so you can tweet along with the event and get the conversation going that way. But for now, that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Emily to tell us a bit more about the book and the ideas in it. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And firstly, thank you very much to IPPR for hosting this, and all of the panelists. I'm so excited to hear their thoughts and views on this. All three of them are people whose work I really admire and I think is really important if we want to genuinely tackle exploitation. So this is also a really great event for me to be in as an audience member as much as a participant. And the second thing I'm going to mention is that it's torrentially raining where I am. So if you can hear strange sounds, that's why. So the book, The Truth About Modern Slavery, is about what is modern slavery, but it's not about its simple definition. But before I come to what it's really about, just to give that definition in case anyone's not sure what we're talking about, because it's interesting. It's a kind of phrase that's traveled a lot, but people often don't really know what's being talked about. Modern slavery is an umbrella term for a range of severely exploitative circumstances, including human trafficking, forced labor, domestic servitude, various other ones. And they all have in common that they are circumstances that are difficult to leave for the person in them, or difficult for them to refuse to enter in the first place. However, the difficulty there, it could be physical threats, it could be violence, but it also could be that the alternative is destitution, that the alternative is being subject to immigration control. So it's a very, very wide meaning. And it became a popular way of talking about exploitation through the 2000s, with particular philanthrocapitalists picking up this term and using it. And then in the 2010s in the UK, especially, so Theresa May really made this her kind of political calling card, both nationally and globally. And as I show in the book, arguably used it to offset, to kind of morally counterweight her hostile environment policies. But I'm less interested in the kind of dictionary definition of what is modern slavery, as in what is modern slavery as a story about exploitation, exactly as Karis says, as a tool that's being used in particular ways. And I draw here on the work of someone called George Lakoff, who is a cognitive linguist in the US, and people might be familiar with his very, very popular short book, Don't Think of an Elephant. So this is all about framing, frames being mental structures that shape how we see the world and how we receive new information. And whether we're experts on framing or not, I think a really useful way to think about it is as a literal frame, which when I'm doing these talks is very helpful at the moment because we're all in little frames. So thinking about modern slavery as a particular picture of exploitation and asking what's in that picture, what characters are being shown, are they being portrayed as heroes or villains? What causes are shown? What solutions? And perhaps most crucially of all, what's outside the frame? What are we not seeing? So drawing on insights from working on this topic and also many years before that of working on kind of social justice stuff and worker exploitation and things like that, and analysing various texts and speeches and so on in the book, I show that modern slavery as a story about exploitation is one that says exploitation is a rare and extreme occurrence. It's an anomaly, an aberration that is something separate to the general socioeconomic conditions perpetrated by an individual deviant, right? So essentially like a baddie comes in and does a bad thing, but it's got nothing to do with the general social and economic structures. And you see this really clearly in the language that's used by proponents of this story. And by people, of course, who just want to end exploitation and don't necessarily realize what they're playing into, which I've definitely been part of in the past. So the language is modern slavery. These are direct quotes. It's a parasite. It's a virus. We need to inoculate people against it. We need to scrub supply chains clean. All of this language is about portraying something that is like a stain on top of something that's otherwise fine, right? It's a contaminant, but everything is otherwise fine. And really, I think, as I talk about in the book, this is kind of essentially a fairy tale about exploitation that we're being told, right? So you've got your deviant individual, often kind of racialized foreign gang in this narrative. You've got your innocent victim who's lured or duped. You always get these words, right, that are implying ignorance on the part of someone who ends up being exploited. And then you have the hero, which is usually cast as the government, you know, law enforcement, raiding and rescuing people, NGOs that purport to rescue people, or even you and I, who apparently can solve it by being ethical consumers, right? So it's just like, we know that story from lots of fairy tales. You've got villain, hero, innocent person who is lured into harm's way. And I think it's a really comforting way to think about exploitation because it makes it feel really coherent and singular. And we all know tales about vanquishing monsters, and here's another one. And what's another tale we know about vanquishing a monster of exploitation? Well, it's the story of historical slavery. It's a very specific UK retelling of historical slavery, where we, the UK, and particularly characters like William Wilberforce, are apparently the heroes in that story, right? So the kind of nationalistic storyline there is that we abolished slavery in the early 19th century. Now, of course, there's problems with these portrayals. There's a political theorist called Carol Backey who says that when a social problem is being presented to us, we need to ask ourselves who benefits from the way it's being presented. And I find that an incredibly useful question to think about. We know to interrogate things when it comes to like marketing and advertising. So if I was a cigarette company and I was like, my new cigarette is really good for you, you're not going to believe me, clearly. But when it comes to humanitarian topics that are criminal only, apparently, we can drop that lens, that interrogatory lens, and forget to ask those questions. And as I argue in the book, and as I think people who work closely on these topics are all too well aware, the problem is not a parasite coming from the outside. The problem is not that people who end up being exploited just didn't know about the existence of that parasite and ended up in harm's way. The problem is the very political choices that are underpinning our society and our economy. And that's a rather less comforting story. And I show how this operates across a range of key thematic themes on this topic. So migration policy, the sex sector, big brands and their supply chains, and also the story about our role as the public and like awareness raising as a solution. So I won't give lots of detail, but just to give a kind of flavor on immigration policy, for example, when we're thinking about this topic as one of criminals, one of kind of accidental evil aberrations occurring, it seems that we should lay the blame at the foot of the traffickers, at the foot of the exploiters. And of course, there is a justice element there needed. But actually, that hides from view the role of immigration policy, creating the conditions for exploitation to thrive. So hostile environment immigration policies, which make people who are undocumented in the UK criminals, which make it illegal to work in the UK if you're undocumented, directly creates a pool of people who are exploitable because they don't have any rights. It's so well evidenced now as well that people who would be offenders will purposefully recruit undocumented people and will use the threat of denouncing them to the authorities as a way to coerce them. So you have immigration policy directly creating that marketplace of exploitable labor. You have comparable things across all the spaces I've mentioned. So I think one of the most obvious ones is around social safety nets and kind of the welfare state, where you have acknowledged by government homeless shelters being recruiting grounds for traffickers. People go there to find people to exploit. Why? Because destitute people are going to say yes to a dodgy job offer. Obviously, it's a pool of people who have no better options. But the solution through the modern slavery story lens is what government's done, which is to raise awareness in homeless shelters of modern slavery, to help people spot the signs of slaves in homeless shelters, rather than the systemic solution, which is trying to address destitution in the first place. And you see the same thing with the drug trafficking done by children, which is called county lines. The children most likely to end up in county lines, according to the National Crime Agency, are those with limited economic opportunities. So essentially, you have this picture of exploitation as being caused by something extraneous to the system that we're living in. And therefore, we lose sight of these underlying causes. We lose sight of how vulnerability to being exploited is politically constructed. And we allow the idea to pervade that this can be solved by law enforcement on the one hand, and by just undoing people's ignorance about the risks on the other. And none of that is about people's actual livelihoods, people having decent options, addressing people's rights and power imbalances. So I try to give in the book at the end of each thematic chapter, like a range of fairly pragmatic, sometimes bolder suggestions for things that we could do to try to improve the situation and make people less vulnerable and kind of stop playing this fairy tale. And really what it comes down to for me is understanding that nobody has to be vulnerable to exploitation. It's a political choice. And starting to unpick the rhetoric that's being used about modern slavery today, and instead have a real conversation about resilience, about rights, and about decent options.
Thank you very much, Emily. That's really fascinating, and yeah, makes me want to go back and look again at those sections of the book. I said I wouldn't do this, but I have a question for you. So I wonder if I can put that to you now, which is just, we're at IPPR, but obviously lots of people on this call, I would imagine, really deeply care about these issues and want to be helpful. How do you think people in that position can weigh up a kind of a pragmatic choice to work within the frame versus challenging it and becoming a bit of an outsider? How would you suggest they approach that challenge?
Yeah, I think this is like the kind of big question on so many topics, actually. It's the endless question of, are we actually creating enough change by kind of playing within the rules or not? And there's often no like real good answer to that. But I think one thing that I do think is quite important to say is that there are organizations and experts and academics who've been working on exploitation, on these trafficking, these topics for many, many years, who've seen the modern slavery story kind of rise and take hold, and who've tried to play within its structures to win better support for people that have been exploited, to win different migration policies, to win these things. And it hasn't worked very well. Most people who've been doing it for that long now are seeing that actually it's kind of just all been co-opted into this merry-go-round of not really solving the problems. And that if organizations are coming now to the topic to really not take an ahistorical stance, but to understand that there's many, many years of people trying to use this frame to push for what's actually needed, and it's not really worked. We're in a worse position now than we used to be. I think that there's a really interesting thing that, and I notice it especially when I'm doing book events now at the moment, it's very clear to me. The genius of the modern slavery story is that it creates this very neat idea of singularity, right? It's like there's a single issue. We can put a giant number on it and say it's one thing and it's this monster that we're going to behead. And it makes people look for like silver bullet solutions and that kind of thing. And in reality, exploitation, it's like complex and messy and plural. And for some people, the solution will be better social safety nets. For some people, it will be more decent work opportunities. There's all sorts of, it's a plural space. So I would say, I think it's always worth having a question in our minds of like, why do we think everything should be kind of packageable in a really neat way? And it's a much bigger thought than this book or this webinar, but I do wonder sometimes that's like the impact of branding almost on our subconscious. The other thing though, I just finally say is that like, I also have a very like pragmatic wish to make change now. And I think I have a dislike of people that are where if you're in a good situation and you only want to go for the kind of political imaginary, when we really need change now for many, many people. So I think the answer to that is if you are in modern slavery spaces, if you are kind of starting to work on modern slavery policy using that idea, to do your best always to be pulling it towards the causes, not the symptoms. Exploitation is a symptom, and we need to be talking about the causes. And that would pull the conversation to questions about resilience, about decent opportunities, about ongoing infrastructure, right? So for example, unions versus periodic audits. So trying to make sure the conversation is about that. But as I say, people have been doing that for quite a long time, and it's not been working that well, but maybe more people doing it will help.
Thanks, that's a very helpful answer. And I really liked in your talk the way your illustration of the frame, because I think we talk about framing often without actually kind of thinking, hang on, what does that actually mean? And thinking about who sits outside of that and so on, I think is quite instructive. I'm going to turn now to Alex. And Alex, you've been involved in a lot of campaigning around modern forms of exploitation. So Alex co-chairs the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Sport, Modern Slavery and Human Rights, and is also a member of the APPG on human trafficking and modern slavery. What are your reflections on what Emily set out, given that campaigning work that you've done?
Thanks, Karis, and thank you for having me, and thank you, Emily, for having me on your panel as well. It's a real thrill with you having done and put the efforts you put into your book to have my chance to say something about it. And let's see if you agree with me. I am used to putting my ideas to Emily and her disagreeing with me, so there's a certain symmetry in that. But as Karis says, I'm Alex Norris. I'm a member of Parliament for Nottingham North, and I'm the Shadow Public Health Minister. So I don't set our Home Office policy. But if during the next hour or so I do manage to do so, I hope Home Office colleagues will see that as part of life's rich tapestry. I have to say, when Emily, when I saw you announce that you were leaving Flex and you were writing this book, and you were going to be able to speak in an unfiltered manner, I did think, firstly, blimey, that was her filtered, was it? But also, I didn't know if the world needed another book on slavery, modern slavery. But actually, having read the book, I shouldn't have worried that actually this is, I think, the book that we needed, in that you have certainly shattered the cozy consensus around it. And it made the word I kept writing down in my notes was uncomfortable. It made me feel uncomfortable multiple times. I think that's exactly what you wanted to do. I think that's a very good thing indeed. And as much as a book about slavery, you've written a book about language, especially political language, and about power and power imbalances, which I think is something that should, cause certainly people like me on the left, certainly give us cause to kind of reflect on the way in which we campaign, the way in which we talk about issues, and the way in which we try and secure change. Karis, I wandered into this issue really. I've never been in this kind of space professionally before politics, but it happened when I worked for Unison. It wasn't even in my union, but at Shirebrook at Sports Direct. There's just 6 or 7 miles from where I live, in my personal supply chain, was really shocking revelations and incredible work done by Unite the Union. And that first made me interested in the issue. And that wasn't long before I was elected to Parliament. And you get to Parliament, and you have this whole smorgasbord of everything in the world you could be interested in. And if you do everything, then you'll do nothing. So you try and choose a few things. And so slavery was the space I came into, and which is how I met Emily, and was on the Home Office Select Committee for a while, where we had some great fun with Sajid Javid when he was Home Secretary. But I did think, reflecting on Emily's book and on how she's introduced the session, there's nothing in the things that Emily and you said around language. I've used all of those things at some point, whether that's the scrubbing the supply chain, whether that's there's someone over there, evil person that sits behind it, the individualization of perpetration. I've done that and been part of that, and that I would argue is pretty much endemic in Parliament. You talk in your book about how narrative frames can be taken over, and I think my reflections on the narrative frame around modern slavery, I think like the modern slavery bit, but that's how it's understood in Parliament. I don't think it's taken over in the sense of, politics, your opponents steal your language when it's good language. So I don't think it's stolen and used for an alternative set of principles or ideals. But what it has done, it is used by people who have very different worldviews, who might mean the same sort of substantive outcome, but whose methods would be radically different. And that has a rather chilling effect on that discussion, because it's almost like, Home Office questions. You go through a list of 25 questions on a Tuesday. You disagree on all 24 of them, related to the first 24 relating to the immigration system, relating to policing, whatever it is. And all right, this one's about modern slavery. Here's where we do the agreeing. And that is good to a certain point of view, because actually that's how you get legislation through. And we wouldn't have a Modern Slavery Act if we hadn't had that. I work, as Karis, as you said in the introduction, I work cross-party on this issue. Mainly it's a major function of being in opposition. How else am I going to change anything until there's an election? And I sit around the table with people from all parties and none, and we'll do again tomorrow when it's our APPG for slavery and trafficking's AGM, and we will produce a cross-party slate of officers. and there is something in that about what that means for actually changing things, because all of those people desperately want to eradicate slavery just as much as I do. However, their views on system change are entirely different to mine. And you concede in the book, and that there is, again, thinking about my defaults. I default to whack the bad guys, equip the public to be more vigilant, equip the public with the information they need to clear their own supply chains. And if you do that, the world will be a better place. And actually, I think if you do those things, the world would be a better place. And I don't think there's anything in the challenges that you pose that stop us from doing those things. Our danger is that we stop after we've done those things, or to the best of our abilities do those things, and then that's kind of it. And I think the theme that came out of the book over and over again, I think it's so important that we kind of stress this, is that you often kind of pick at the uncomfortable border between the perpetrator and the victim. Of course, certainly when we're talking about children, you can very much be both of those things. And actually, the conclusion you draw is that it's the system that's the perpetrator, and the rest kind of flows and follows from that. And that, and therein, I think, lies the kind of uncomfortable thing and the awkwardness, because that smashes your consensus straight away. Because actually, if I sit around the table with having voted, I wasn't in Parliament then, but as I would have voted for the Modern Slavery Act and have the same voting record as Theresa May, if we talked about our views on system change, there would be as if we were from two different planets. So there's a really uncomfortable question, I think, for a politician there about how do you affect change whilst working with a narrative frame that everybody kind of agrees on, but really that agreement's that agreement only goes so far. And then just before I finish, Karis, just wanted to pull out a couple more themes that kind of didn't fit in, but I think are just worth reflecting on. For me, and I'm sure this will be the kind of theme of a lot of IPPR's work between now and the next general election. In Britain, we're really, really good at individualizing problems. It's one of the things having a really developed healthcare system. You point at someone and say, well, your leg's broken, here's your cast. Point at someone, you've got, you're having problems with your mental health, here's your prescription, or here's your walking group, whatever it is. And every time we individualize all those things, and we never look, and we stop there because we're able to meet those needs. So we never look at the environmental factors. And again, I think this was a book about environmental factors. And I think for Labour and for positioning ourselves to win the next general election, how we win that conversation is going to be absolutely critical, to say to people that the thing about Marcus Rashford and free school meals was not the food bit of food poverty, though that was vital that we tackled that in its short term. It was the poverty bit of food poverty. And why does that exist? And why does that exist in the same household and on my estates over and over again? And how we get from the individualization to that environmental analysis, I think, is critical. And I think perhaps we need to employ Emily to put some of those things a bit more plainly to us, because I think we fall into those defaults. And then just a couple of bits. I think it's really important, and I'm conscious I could derail the whole session by raising this particularly, but it's because it's an issue that I'm so uncomfortable talking about because I cannot make my mind up on. But the whole chapter on sex work is a book in itself. I think it's really important because on every other aspect of the book, every one of Emily's followers on Twitter, bar probably a few people who follow her just to shout at her, would agree with virtually everything she says, except for in that chapter where you'd start to get a divergence of thought. And I think that's really interesting. I wonder if that might be the next book, but I think that's great. And I think we do have to at least have that conversation to come to some sort of place about, certainly from a political point of view, where a Labour government goes into that space. But also on, and I'll conclude here, on the points made about the universal basic income, because it is seen as a bit of a panacea for a lot of the ills that we've got, in the sense that, well, the environment is coercing people into these things that aren't actually, they're not being duped. It's just at that time they perceive it to be their best option because of a lack of income. Okay, here's a way of giving them steady alternative income. But that too, I think, is a sticking plaster that doesn't solve any of the systemic challenges that sit behind that. Now, and I think you kind of write that very well in its both ways, in that it's something that may be of use, but actually that there are greater things that go beyond that. And I think just to chuck that as an answer to any of our problems, and that is a bit now, I think, of a growing trend, I don't think quite works. So yes, lots in there, Karis. It was a fantastic read. It was, it read like Emily herself, which I think is always a great sign of a book. I think there's a lot in there, as I say, that to make certainly politicians on the left uncomfortable. And I kind of, if you can enjoy your own discomfort, I kind of did enjoy my own discomfort. It certainly made me challenge my own practice. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alex. That's really interesting to hear your perspective, and hopefully Pluto Press are on the call and note your request for a second book. I'm going to move now on to quite a different perspective to Peter, who is a postgraduate research student at the University of Nottingham, and his research project explores something in a different context, how popular child protection and child saving rhetoric compares with the realities of child domestic work in southwest Nigeria. So Peter, I wondered if you could tell us a bit about your research and your reflections on Emily's argument, I guess particularly around how that rhetoric shapes our understanding of these concepts.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. And I really, really appreciate this opportunity to be a panelist on this. So like you mentioned, I've recently completed my PhD at the University of Nottingham. So, and basically for the PhD, I look at this idea of saving children, right? Children particularly trapped in exploitative child domestic work, and the activities of NGOs, international organizations, ILO, and all of these working to save them. And there's this general narrative that these children are ignorant, their parents are heartless, their employers are cruel, the traffickers or the intermediaries are heartless, and all of these. But communicating with these individuals and trying to move between the different locations from their places of origin to where they work, you could see that this narrative is highly reductive and selective. So this narrative tend to, for example, blame the individuals for their poverty, that, oh, you're just ignorant, you don't know that there is evil awaiting you where you're going. So this narrative assumes that these individuals are ignorant because they don't know what is awaiting them where they're going. And because of that, they run into the malevolent trafficker and all that. But then this narrative ignores several factors, like, for example, widespread rural-urban disparity in most West African countries. So you have this this issue of susceptibility of subsistence farmers. So most of them are subsistence farmers. They are susceptible to these issues of climate change, to the fluctuations in global prices of agricultural products and all that. So all of these affect their ability to actually cater for them. And surprisingly, in countries like Nigeria and other West African countries, they have very poor maternity leave policies. So for example, there is no paternity leave. So you discover that there is also a genuine demand for what child domestic workers do. So these factors interact to create a market for child domestic work. And but what happened is the modern slavery or the human trafficking narrative ignores all these problems to say, oh, these individuals are ignorant. If you can just increase the awareness creation, go to the TV, go to the national television, the radio stations to campaign against this. So what happened is individuals keep hearing these messages, but they keep doing whatever they decided to do because they needed to survive. So individuals keep turning deaf ears to these messages. And I had several cases of children that were rescued by NGOs before going back to child domestic work, because the NGOs that rescued them in most cases, did not provide for them, did not cater for their basic needs, and more importantly, did not address the infrastructural deficits that really push some of these individuals. So for example, you have cases where children that have completed high school do not have access to student loans, they cannot go to universities, and then the universities are actually not located where they are. So the only opportunity they have is to migrate to where the universities are and to work temporarily in order to be able to raise money to go to university. So, but the modern slavery or the trafficking narrative ignores all these problems to say these individuals are ignorant. Let's keep educating them while ignoring these other fundamental issues, pushing them into child domestic work. And for most of these individuals involved in this work, to them, the work is a sort of a temporary arrangement just to achieve certain life goals, which the system makes impossible for them to achieve. So, and for many of them, they actually question the activities of these NGOs, question the activities of international organizations that if you want to help us, these are the serious issues facing us that you need to talk about. But if you're not talking about these issues, there is no way you'll be able to discourage us effectively, regardless of what you do, regardless of the money you pump into the system. We'll keep going back to that. And just to wrap up, I think it's something that also has to do with the issue of power balance, power relations, particularly between maybe Western countries and non-Western societies. So what I discovered, for example, is that most of these non-Western societies, they realized the enormity of the challenges, but because they needed to present a particular narrative that, oh, we are working hard to eradicate this problem. So they present certain pictures, certain images to the US, to the UK, to DFID that, oh, you know what, this is what we are doing. Can you give us more money? Because they don't want to lose the support of the UK or the US. So they continue to present this narrative that we are working very hard to solve this problem. Whereas within the local context, you know, the problems are deeply rooted in infrastructural deficit, in challenges with inequalities in this society, as well as other issues that affect some of the poorest people in the third world countries, as we call them. So I think I'll just stop here.
Thanks very much, Peter. And really strong themes coming through of putting down a bit of a challenge to the NGOs and people working in the sector, right, in terms of how they approach these issues and whether they're actually moving forwards on them, as well as to countries like the UK, not just in the UK, but beyond our borders as well. So thanks very much for that contribution. I'm finally going to turn to our final panelist, who is Lucy. So Lucy is a research fellow on our work on migration and integration, and she's led a lot of work that's relevant to this, including around the hostile environment and the migration system, and also led on a research project that I'm just going to do a special shout out to because it was really fascinating, which was our Communities Up Close study, and that was a 2-year study speaking with residents across Yorkshire and the Humber about their attitudes to migration. And I think that really might inform, I'm springing on you, Lucy, but it might inform your response in terms of the language and the stories that we tell. So I'm going to turn to Lucy for your reflections on Emily's book and how that applies to your work.
Thank you. I might come back to that in the questions a little bit, but yeah, thanks so much. And yeah, first of all, I guess I just really want to thank Emily for writing the book. I've really enjoyed doing this for my day job. It's been great to, yeah, it's been really enlightening. So yeah, really enjoyed that. Thank you. And I think I found it a really sort of clear breakdown of the modern slavery story. So including sort of the grains of truth and the stark reality on which it's founded, but also the illusions and the fairy tale tropes that you referred to earlier that it perpetuates. Someone's at my door. The extended analogy used in the book, in which modern slavery is viewed politically as a contaminant in an otherwise functioning society, suggesting that it could be eradicated in the same way we might look to eradicate disease, which we already know is not that easy, is really instructive, I think. So you show the way in which experiences of trafficking and exploitation sort of don't simply manifest out of thin air, but are a tangible product of the inequalities that exist within our economy and society. So Emily highlights the depoliticization of exploitation, so whereby politicians can talk about ending modern slavery on the one hand and about creating or upholding a very hostile environment for illegal migrants on the other hand. And it's policies such as those on that hand that constitute the hostile environment that in fact sustain and promote the exploitative practices of employers, so they can't be separated. And My background is working in domestic abuse, and so it was really interesting to me that it really struck me as having a lot of similarities. So like perpetrators of domestic abuse, employers, as you were saying, are able to use the knowledge of someone's precarious immigration status against them, forcing them to do things that they don't want to do for fear of detention and deportation. And because of this and what you set out in the book, really clearly a law and enforcement approach which is the main approach taken by the government currently to tackle modern slavery, is insufficient. And so we need wholesale change to the legislation and rules that push people into exploitation, and which understandably sort of deter people from reporting their exploitation and seeking support. So what I want to do is really refer to our hostile environment work that we've recently been doing. So just going to bring it back to some of the policies that you refer to in the book. And yeah, so in large part, I'll talk about the hostile environment, but I'll touch on some other things too, including sort of broader immigration rules and how those intersect with employers in the workplace. So hostility in the immigration system has a really long history, as I'm sure everyone here is aware of, in terms of immigration. And that hostility tends to have worst consequences for poorer migrants, and of course this is heavily racialised as well, for whom there are fewer choices available in terms of safe and legal routes in terms of getting to the UK, and who can't then easily pay very high fees to regularise their status once they're in the UK, and therefore more likely to become undocumented. And the hostile environment has really been championed, I guess, since the late noughties, with legislation that introduced much of those sort of policies. The Immigration Acts 2014 and 16, which you note in the book, bookend the Modern Slavery Act 2015, which I think is really interesting. And these introduced a series of checks, charges and data sharing requirements within employment and public services, blocking many from accessing services and support, including in cases of exploitation. And the stated aim of that approach is apparently to encourage people to leave the country voluntarily. But there's really little evidence to show that that's happened, and there's loads of evidence to show that it's driven people into destitution and that it's fostered racism and discrimination across society. And employment and an income are undoubtedly essential for us all to be able to survive. However, for people without an immigration status, it's a criminal offence for them to work. So right to work checks we talk about in the report drive many people into the shadow economy, meaning that employers can get away with flouting workers' rights and all those things that we've already talked about. So they can coerce and control people. And those facing exploitative conditions are unlikely to feel like they can come forward as a result of cooperation, for instance, between the police and labour inspectors with the Home Office, for instance, through joint workplace raids and data sharing for the purposes of immigration enforcement, which can lead to people facing detention and deportation. So people are left with very few choices. Either remain in exploitation, become destitute by running away, or go to the authorities and risk criminalisation and deportation. It's pretty poor series of choices. And if we look at the sectors in the formal economy that rely heavily on migrant labour, it's often those sectors in which exploitative practices are able to occur. So it might be in terms of cleaning, construction, hospitality and childcare. And enforcing rights and regulations in those sectors is down to labour inspectors, but a recent report that my colleague Marley Morris wrote highlights that in the UK we have one of the weakest labour market enforcement systems in the EU, and they're drawing on Flex's work. So they noted that there were 0.4 labour inspectors per 10,000 workers in the UK, which is the equivalent of someone doing a 2-day-a-week role, I guess, inspecting the labour conditions of 10,000 people, which seems pretty mad to me. So which brings me to my concluding points, I guess, about what needs to change. So starting with that last point, we need to invest far more resources in labour inspectors so that they can broaden their focus to those sectors that I just mentioned. So currently they concentrate more so on like agriculture and horticulture, food processing and shellfish gathering, which is super important, but I guess we also need to expand our focus. And labour inspectors, like most other public servants, must not de facto cooperate with the Home Office, and certainly not for the purposes of immigration enforcement. And without that delinking, we won't build the trust necessary to properly support victims of exploitation and redress the harms they've faced. And more fundamentally, we really need to stop criminalising people that are working by removing the offence of illegal working. So we recommend that in our recent report, so that people can come forward if they're experiencing exploitation without fear of being treated punitively. And there are a number of other recommendations I just wanted to mention that really try to sort of go for a root and branch and pragmatic change of the UK's approach to immigration enforcement. And these included repealing and reforming a number of provisions in the Immigration Acts. So in terms of employment, we suggested that as well as removing the criminal offence of illegal working, that the burden of making right to rent checks is moved to the DWP rather than sitting with employers, and that should be done through national insurance numbers. And we called, really importantly, for the introduction of a statutory firewall to guarantee safe services for migrants, so preventing police and other public bodies from sharing data about an individual's immigration status where that is for the purposes of immigration enforcement. We made calls to reform the Home Office, and we're not the only one, in order to develop a fairer and more just approach to immigration through strengthening evidence-based approaches to decision-making, tackling discrimination through regular assessment of kind of the impacts of decisions on different minority ethnic groups, and ensuring that the department is subject to scrutiny through an independent body set up to protect migrants' rights. And we think that that really needs to include the Home Office listening more to people affected by immigration policies, and which I know is how you conclude your book, and that the scrutiny body should be led by people with direct experience of the immigration system. So that's really key. And finally, we talked about improved routes to regularisation. Existing routes are really convoluted and expensive and really difficult to access. So we recommended a number of things, including a new vulnerable situation route, which would be for people in particularly vulnerable situations, including people facing exploitation, which could provide indefinite leave to remain rather than temporary solutions that are drawn out and costly to maintain and convert into long-term settlement. Yeah, I think I'll finish there, and in my closing remarks, I'll come to a couple of other things. But yeah, just thank you so much for the book. It's been great to review it.
Thank you, Lucy. And I think our team have shared in the chat a link to our report on the hostile environment, which you can look up. So we've got a lot of questions from the audience. I'm going to add one of my own to kick us off while we're just selecting those, which is really coming back to something that Alex said, and Emily, I wondered if you could come back on this, which is about that distinction between means and ends. So to what extent do you think that actually the end is the same across the kind of political spectrum and the people, the actors acting on this, and to what extent is it different? Could you have the kind of systemic solutions that you advocate for without having a kind of broader progressive vision for how the economy and society operates?
Yeah, it's a really excellent question, and also a really good way of conceptualizing it. I think it feels like the answer should be that the means are different and the end is the same. Nobody wants modern slavery to exist. There's a couple of academics who say that criticizing the modern slavery narrative is akin to criticizing motherhood and apple pie, and it's just a brilliant point. But actually, I think that the idea that there could be divergent methods to solving the same problem is born of a misunderstanding of how exploitation occurs. So what you see with the modern slavery paradigm, that particular story, is, as I say, like this idea that it's kind of anomalous. But in reality, labour conditions, whether in legal or illegal sectors, are a continuum. So you have like decent conditions at one end through lower level forms of abuse that would be things like underpayment of wages, to the most extreme forms of harm in the labour market. And these occur in relationship to each other. Firstly, because people can move along that continuum. So if you are, for example, an undocumented migrant and you're in like dodgy work, the employer knows they can impose worse and worse conditions on you. So you end up moving further and further into modern slavery act territory. But also in general, the more you have a labour market, the more you have work structures that have a lack of rights and protections, the more permeable it is to harm at all levels, basically. So, and that permeability is caused by things like erosion of trade unions, lack of labour market enforcement, the hostile environment, all sorts of things like that. So really, I think that it's like the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Trafficking said a few months ago, where you have a lot of labour abuse, you have a breeding ground for trafficking, right? And it's interesting, in the book, I actually mentioned the Sports Direct Shirebrook warehouse, which I'd forgotten until you said that, Alex, that I thought it was really interesting that, so obviously Sports Direct is pretty well known as having had allegedly dubious practices in its warehouses historically, and how it treats workers not being great, but that being a kind of product of advanced capitalism, you know, the things that we are uncomfortable with that are happening in Amazon warehouses and so on and so forth. But how interesting that in 2016 there were three modern slavery court cases relating to workers at the Shirebrook warehouse as well. Where you have one, you have the other. Same thing in Leicester with the garment sector and endemic labour abuses. And you will also have some of the more extreme things, hand car washes, same thing. So I think that part of the problem is the idea that they're separable, and actually they're not. And what we need to be doing is undoing that permeability, and that will help to address the extreme, the end that we want, as much as the lower levels.
Thanks very much, Emily. I'm going to turn to audience questions so that we can turn to as many of these as possible. I'll read out a few and then turn to different members of our panel. So there's one here from an anonymous attendee, which is, have you heard of any international examples of addressing the systematic causes of modern slavery, which we could learn from in the UK? And Peter, I'd be really interested to hear from your research, in particular, if there's something there that we could pull across to the UK and learn from. Also, Emily, I wonder if you've got examples in the book. Another question from another anonymous attendee is, do you think changes to immigration controls as a result of Brexit will make modern slavery more or less likely? Lucy and Alex, I wonder if that might be one for you. And then quite a practical one here that I think we should address, which is from Ben, which is, if I suspect that a nail bar, for example, may be using slaves, what is my best line of action as an individual? And Alex, I wonder if that might be one for you to pick up as well. So Peter, should we start with you on the international examples?
Yeah, thank you. I think I have a bit of an issue with the question, because you see, when you say international example that can be used in the UK, you're trying to say you're trying to disentangle the issue, as if, for example, the issue in the UK is different from the issue elsewhere, but it's the same global capitalism we're talking about. So in most cases, the effect of the UK policies or the US policies can be felt all over the world. So what happens is individuals respond to this in different ways. So if you were talking about international systemic causes, you have to look at intergovernmental policies beyond the UK government. So for example, there's an excellent academic, Howard Neil, that wrote excellently about how policies on US cutting subsidies affect poor farmers in West Africa. So in that case, unless you are able to address the issue of US subsidy, you will not be able to address issues of modern slavery, whether in the US or in the UK or elsewhere. It's the same with issues like the US and the UK's involvement in Syrian war and all of these. So these led these individuals to migrate at all costs. And in the course of seeking migration at all costs, they become susceptible to traffickers or people that are willing to offer them unrealistic expectations, and then they become victims. So my point is that all these systems are connected. You're talking about this same global capitalism, which has many aspects, and you cannot begin to unpack that, okay, this is the part that will affect us in the UK, or this is the fact that does not affect us in the UK. You have to look at the system as a whole before you can see what works and what does not work.
Thanks, Peter. What's your view on that, Emily?
Well, firstly, as someone just said, that was an excellent answer. I agree with the person who's put that in chat. Yeah, I mean, I very much agree. And also, yeah, I suppose I have a couple of things that I think are useful to think about it. So I kind of think the question itself is a problem as well. But in addition to the way Peter does, the idea, again, this like singularity idea about modern slavery, that there should be like, that it's like trying to like get people to wear seatbelts. Like we should just be able to like port something from one place over to another. That's like a unique, bespoke, special policy that tackles modern slavery. And we're seeing this so much in this space at the moment with technology. Oh, you can't move for people who think that an app is the solution to this problem at the moment. In reality, what we're talking about, if we want to look at international examples, that would mean looking at examples from around the world that undo the things that make people vulnerable and undo the structures that make it more likely that there's going to be exploitative work taking place. So, for example, having sufficient social safety nets, having a welfare state that sufficiently supports people would be one of them. But we don't really, we don't really need to look abroad for that. There are some specifics with regard to global supply chains that I think are really interesting. And so one of them, supply chains, which are really webs nowadays, like long and broad and complex, and as an amazing professor called Genevieve LeBaron says, very much constructed in that way on purpose to create distance, legal distance for corporations from what's going on lower down, and to legitimize this idea that it's just too hard to ensure there's no exploitation going on. So you essentially subcontracting so that you can have the cheapest possible labor in countries with low labor laws and so on. Well, in some countries, there's little experiments happening with limiting the number of tiers there can be in supply chains in sectors which are very high risk for exploitation. There's a couple of case studies about it in a report called Risky Business by Focus on Labour Exploitation that was published in 2017. And it's also mentioned in my book in the chapter on brands. And I think that's really interesting. I think, and like looking at things that are structural intervention, not a kind of superficial dancing around the edges thing, are very interesting. Yeah, and then you do have some work that is about supporting safe migration, but this gets into very dodgy territory very quickly, where all too often government programs that purport to be about safe migration or NGO programs are really about discouraging migration. So the Department for International Development had this project in Nigeria, actually, that was about, I like FOI'd a lot of the documents, and they were about discouraging aspirational migration, which nobody would think is an acceptable thing to say unless there was like a kind of racist backdrop in people's minds, So I think there are some examples of it being done well. Like I think it was a union in Myanmar, but that's like peer to peer, people supporting each other to know their rights and risks. And I think that that's great, as we would all want that if we were migrating somewhere, but certainly not one that's done in an imposing way, trying to deter migration, which is very problematic. So, I mean, basically the solutions we could look at from abroad are solutions to, the systemic impoverishment and dispossession of people's rights.
Thank you. Let's turn now to the second question, which was about the impact of Brexit. Lucy, I don't know if you want to pick this one up.
Yes, sorry, I was struggling to unmute there. I will be linking back to a report that's already been shared that Marley wrote. But I guess, first of all, I feel like I'm not overly optimistic about the post-Brexit immigration system's ability to sort of tackle modern slavery, given that we've been talking about the need for sort of serious root and branch change. So I think the change is yet to come. I don't think it's currently written into legislation. But yeah, the new points-based system, I guess Marley writes about in the post-Brexit immigration system report, the fact that the new system has these inherent risks that could lead to increased poor working practices, because obviously a pool of workers has sort of disappeared with the end of freedom of movement, and fewer rights for EU migrants to work in the UK. So employers might turn to sort of more informal, shall we say, working practices to recruit people to fill their sort of labour needs. So that could sort of lead to more vulnerability for workers. On the other hand, there are a number of recommendations that are made in that report that I think are worth engaging with in terms of more sort of technical applications that could be applied to the points-based system. One of the, I guess, benefits of the points-based system is that there is a degree of flexibility within it. And so it can be amended and adapted, and there could be sort of some progressive options added on to the existing points-based system that would see, for instance, employers having to prove that they were ensuring that their conditions for their workers were fair and that they were paying sort of the real living wage for all workers before they were able to sort of support applicants to come to the UK. So there could be things that you sort of make employers do that could then improve the employment conditions more broadly, but there are recommendations at this point yet to be adopted.
Thanks, Lucy. Alex, I wonder if you've got views on that question, and also the quite practical question of what an individual should do if they suspect slavery in a particular setting.
Yeah, very much so. Thanks, Karis. I mean, this actually goes back to when Emily and I first met. So there's this single Brexit happens. So your relationship as a nation with migrant labour changes completely. Your needs don't change very much at all, and that's kind of lost from the discourse entirely. So let me start with agricultural workers. So the fruit that needs picking still needs picking. And the idea that there's a pool of either enough or indeed interested people living already in the UK to mop that up, well, that's not true, and everyone knows that. So you need to replicate those labour arrangements, and that's what the government is feverishly doing. And that's what they started a small pilot originally called the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Scheme. It was basically the idea that for 6 months, people would come over for 6 months, pick the fruit at peak season, and then be off again. It's kind of like creating the illusion of control, I think, and that's where Emily and I first met, and we're pressing the Home Office on it, because that scheme's organised by having a number of host labour bodies who have relationships in other countries on the continent, and migrant workers come through them through a number, 2 or 3 companies, and are in Britain, often in isolated and remote environments. Every bit of that has a flashing light saying this is a chance of slavery or forced labour, whatever you want to say. Every bit of that change risky. So we've been pressing very hard on that around the safeguards, and I don't think the government really are taking much interest in the safeguards around whether in the host country, what that arrangement is, how people enter into the scheme, whether those intermediary countries that are notionally UK based, how they operate either. And actually what we've seen since then is that scheme's just expanded and expanded and expanded. And I think eventually will just be the way in which migrant labour comes from the continent into the UK. The 6 months is now already 11 months that you can come for. Eventually it will be 364 days and you go home for an afternoon home, as it were, and then you come back again, because actually the 6 months wasn't working either. People didn't want to enter the scheme in that way. So that's what it looks like. So far from a narrative that says we're going to do things in our national supply chains to try to make sure we're reducing slavery, actually we've created a system that, if anything, creates a greater risk, and that's something that there needs to be a significant spotlight on. And then to address Ben's point, I mean, there is a smorgasbord of places. That is the good thing about the current frame and interest in this issue. So I was just cribbing a few as I was thinking, but there's the Modern Slavery Helpline, there's the Gangmasters Labour Abuse Authority, there's Crime Stoppers, the police. I call any and all of those. It's important that the local intelligence picture is built up. I would always say, my office get very upset about this, I'd always say tell your MP, because we have interactions with all of those organisations. So anyone or all of those will be able to help you. But even if you're kind of more concerns based rather than having a clear smoking gun, if something's triggered in your head because something didn't look right, whether that's not wearing gloves around chemicals or whatever, it's probably worth calling in, I would say.
Thanks very much. So we've got more questions. We've got a couple here about the Modern Slavery Act. So one from Arena saying, what would you consider are the limitations of the Modern Slavery Act, specifically in relation to supporting survivors of human trafficking and modern slavery? And I'm going to put that in together with the next question, which is also about the Act, saying it's been a boon for consultants writing and checking policies, but has otherwise achieved little and needs to be reformed, discussed, which is a great essay question. So I imagine any of our panelists could speak to that question, but I wonder if Emily and Alex, that might be one for you. The other questions I'll come to, there's one, when you speak about the causes, how important do you think it is to highlight the UK's history of colonialism as a key cause? Peter, given your kind of international viewpoint on that, I'd be interested in your views. Emily, I'd also be keen to know if that is something that fits, how that fits into your book. And then finally, I think the third question, because I think it's quite interesting in terms of some of what Emily's work has looked at, is the kind of criminalisation questions. This is from Peter. Should the government amend the law to stop prosecutions of victims of trafficking and modern slavery? And if it did, would this help improve the position in the UK? So I'll come to Lucy on that one, but Emily, you might also want to comment on that. So that's quite a lot for you to comment on. Shall we start with Alex? I don't know if you want to comment on the Modern Slavery Act.
Yeah, thank you. Those are two good questions, especially an essay question on it as well. So I think if I'd answered this before I read Emily's book, I'd have said that the Modern Slavery Act provides us a kind of an unrealised potential for what an anti-slavery environment in British life could look like. And I think, and to an extent, I still believe that. I think actually, having kind of reflected on what Emily said, and actually the Modern Slavery Act, I think, provides us is an attempt, a framework with which to deal with the symptoms of this problem. So, all of those things, if you go past all the things that Emily talks about why this is happening, and you never really want to deal with those symptoms because of the uncomfortable truths, this will give you enough to go to blast at here's a bad person doing a bad thing, here's the vulnerable person. Now, the limit that reaches, to answer the first question, is that it soon buttresses against the Home Office. I've managed not to mention the Home Office so far because I could ruin the rest of the discussion with this, but the Home Office, obviously, in culture and practice, is well behind this conversation, and certainly the high-minded idealistic rhetoric of the Modern Slavery Act. So it is, I would answer it no more than say yes, that it is deficient for survivors, because you're straight away into kind of hostile environment policies. I don't think I would buy quite the point that it's just something for consultants. I think that if pushed properly, Section 54, which I'm very enthusiastic about, it's not going to change the world, but getting companies to comply with modern slavery statements, to do it meaningfully, I think is a good thing. I think there's something about those organizations that choose not to, and in the spirit of what Emily says around the places that were found to have really egregious and scary examples of slavery also having lower level labour issues, then I think also this is a red flag about a culture of an organisation that won't comply with that. And that's why I've been pushing very hard for the minister to enforce against it, because it seems very strange that they're still unwilling to. So I wouldn't say that it's just for consultants. I think it gives us a set of tools that we wouldn't otherwise have. I think it's at least managed to herd people around the idea that we ought to have those tools and therefore use them. So those are good things at trying to hit away at the symptoms of the problem. They're just not going to tackle the problem itself.
Thanks, Alex. Emily, did you want to come in there on the Modern Slavery Act?
Yeah, thank you. So on the question around support for victims in the Modern Slavery Act and how that works. So it's really interesting. The Modern Slavery Act, I think the main way, in my opinion, that it's been useful is for creating some more coherence across crime types. Like, I interview a very senior police officer in the book who has some very interesting things to say, particularly on whether the hostile environment should exist or not, which he thinks it shouldn't. Definitely for police, the Act, and prosecution, the Act kind of undid this bittiness of crimes in other legislation that was a problem, and that was a problem for some people that wanted prosecutions to happen for their own justice of what had happened to them. So I always try to like take my lead from what it is that people who've experienced something want to happen. However, the Act is devoid of putting victim support, survivor support, on a statutory footing. And I think that that's very interesting. And we see that all the way historically, right through this kind of topic. The UN 2000 protocol, which defined human trafficking and is kind of like the thing we use, is a crime control instrument. And all of the things that it makes mandatory for states to do are about introducing laws, and all of the things that are optional and heavily caveated are about supporting victims. And we see this again in ours. The absolutely crucial problem with ours is that we do not provide migrant victims, people who are identified officially as victims of modern slavery by our government. We do not give them the right to remain in the UK. We do not provide them with leave to remain. And this means that we have victims of modern slavery that our government officially recognises as victims locked up in detention centres today, that we deport them, including children. So in that regard, it's clearly missing some really important factors. With regard to the point about consultants, I've worked a lot on Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act, which, for anyone who's not sure, is what Alex was talking about with the transparency and supply chains clause, where companies have to publish a statement annually, large companies, detailing what steps, if any, they've taken to tackle modern slavery in their operations and supply chains. Now, I think firstly, it has created a lot of profit for consultancies and so on. And, you know, it's really easy to talk about companies as kind of like faceless monoliths, but I just often think, as an individual working in one of those companies, charging huge amounts of money to help a company write their modern slavery statement, it's really worth sitting and thinking about the kind of morality of that, and understanding that there are frontline NGOs working with people who've been horrifically exploited, who are so under-resourced in the UK, and that disparity is symptomatic of something. For me, although I actually worked on getting Section 54 into the bill back in 2013, I don't think that it's helped. There are some companies that have done really good things as a result of it, and I try to hold some of them up in the book, and I think that's definitely true. Like, I really agree with Alex's points on that. But because the actual Act does not require companies to do anything except publish a piece of paper once a year, so there's no mandatory actions, there's no mandatory steps that have to be taken, I think it's essentially created this kind of merry-go-round where we're all trying to get this bit of legislation enforced, myself included, totally, when actually the legislation itself isn't a sharp enough tool, isn't doing the job. And what it does is create this thing where I explain in the chapter on brands, where what you get with companies is that they will report on what they're doing, the ones that are actually complying with the law. And it will be things like training staff to spot the signs of a slave, running awareness drives in their business, making sure their ethical sourcing policy says that their suppliers will not use modern slavery. And so they have all these things to report on because they're getting to choose the remedy themselves. What they never do and never therefore report on are things that would tackle their business model. So, for example, crucially, their purchasing practices. This is the prices and conditions that they put on their suppliers, that force conditions down, that force people to be underpaid, that force shadow subcontracting that leads to really severe exploitation. You will never see this piece of legislation working to create changes to those business models. And for me, then it comes down to a political tactics question, and I'm sure it does for like Alex and everyone else too. And I think it's kind of an endless problem in the politics we're operating in of like, do we take the crumb because is that better than nothing? Or do we say, no, the crumb is a distraction and we're going for the loaf? I don't know why I'm using a wheat-based analogy, but you get my point. And I think that that's the really tricky thing with regard to that. Just very briefly on prosecution, there's already, maybe I've misunderstood the question, but there's already a clause in the Modern Slavery Act that can be used to defend someone from being prosecuted for criminal activity if they can show that they were being exploited at the time they committed it. But it's not working very well. Why is that? Because of the hostile environment partly. So people are being picked up and detained when they're identified as undocumented without properly being kind of talked to and interviewed and safeguarded and all the appropriate things to work out whether they were actually being coerced and forced into it. So I think that that's a really important point. Yeah.
Thanks, Emily. Peter, I turn to you now on this colonialisation question and how much we have to understand colonialism as one of the root causes of this. There's also, I just since asking that spotted another question that's relevant, which is whether you think the modern slavery narrative is a continuation of the civilising narrative used in colonialism, which might trigger some interesting responses. What do you think about those questions?
Yeah, I think I'll say yes to the two questions. So there's actually a paper that has been put in the chat box where I actually trace the systemic exploitation as we have in the domestic work sector in West Africa to colonialism. So we can talk about three main factors here. So number one, the fact that colonialism actually disrupted the existing societal arrangement in these countries. So, and then number two, which I think is even more important, is that because of the selective nature of urbanization that accompanied colonialism in West Africa, so it's on record that most of the urban centers that sprang up during colonialism were maybe centers of raw materials and all that. So this stimulated rural-urban migration. This made some areas to be highly developed and some areas to be left behind. And what you discover in West Africa till now is that these patterns of migration still continues. This pattern of uneven development still continues. You still have people migrating to these more developed areas in search of better opportunities. And this is where the old modern slavery or child domestic work is actually operating. And to link it to the second question, of course, colonialism has ended, but then we know of issues of unequal power relations between Western, powerful, rich countries and the poorer countries of the world. So what happens is the Western donors gives you the terms and conditions that these are the policies or these are the things we want you to focus on. These are the problems we have identified in your country, and these are the ways we think you should solve the problem. Not that, oh, can you tell us what the problems are? What do you think needs to be done? So what happened is, in most cases, these governments, they just try to remain in the good books of Western donors. They just play the politics, basically. We'll do what you say, just give us the money that we need, and then the problems continue. So I think in that regard, I would say yes to the two questions. I hope I've been able to answer that.
Thanks, PCS. And Lucy, I don't know if you want to come back with any of those questions. Emily picked up the prosecution point, but if there's anything to add there or reflections on the Modern Slavery Act.
I mean, Emily covered it really, but I guess that I just thought I would reiterate the need to remove the offence of illegal working, because the people that are referred to the national referral mechanism, there was, I think I read it in your book, Emily, that there was a study done where a number of people that had been referred had all been arrested beforehand. So that's, that automatically that stops people and deters people from going to the police or going to services to report exploitation. So yes, I do think amending the law to stop prosecution of victims of trafficking and exploitation is necessary, would improve the lives of the individuals, but would also probably lead to better conditions overall, because employers would no longer have that sort of stick to metaphorically beat people with. Yeah, I think it is important, and I think the firewall that I mentioned is really important as well, in order to sort of move away from this hostile approach that we currently have and try and move more towards a sort of safe services approach where anyone that comes forward in need of support is able to access it.
Great, thank you everybody. So we are drawing to a close on the time we've got for this event. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to just offer some closing remarks. And if you're looking for closing remarks, one thing I might ask is if there's an aspect of this debate that makes you optimistic. So are there opportunities to take now? And I ask that because some of the questions in the Q&A are essentially asking this. We've had a pandemic that may have caused people to reassess how we provide security to people. There's the Uber ruling that Uber drivers are in fact workers. Does that present an opportunity? Similarly, the Home Office has committed to take action following the Windrush scandal. Does that present an opportunity on the hostile environment? What's making you optimistic so that we don't leave our audience leaving this event feeling too pessimistic about the future? I don't know who would like to cover that first. Perhaps Peter? Oh, I think you're on mute, Peter.
I'll say it's not as terrible as it seems, because you have more groups now coming up to say, these are things that need to change in the society. So, for example, you have cases like in Bolivia where working children were able to organize themselves to say, these are the issues that we are faced with, and these are the things that you need to be talking about in the society. And like the Uber ruling that you just mentioned now, I think if there is any positive that we can take from this, I think it's the increasing awareness that the problem is beyond maybe the individuals that we are looking at. It's something that affects the system, the structure, the global society. And then when we begin to hold, for example, policymakers, politicians accountable, when we begin to make them to see these other issues, and then we begin to explore existing mechanisms such as the court of law and all that, I think we'll get there eventually.
Thanks very much. Lucy, I wonder if you want to take that next.
Yeah, thank you. Optimism. Okay, I guess I think it's really important to recognise that we're having these conversations, and that this, we're able to have that, and that there are lots of groups, as Peter's just sort of mentioned, that are doing the work around this, and that are sort of trying to push forward, and especially in terms of what I'm more sort of fluent in around immigration policy is around encouraging and pushing for ambitious policy change. And there are a lot of groups that are doing that, and a lot of cooperation and collaboration between those groups. And I think that gives me cause for optimism. I think there is lots of people that are probably represented in the audience here today that are doing building on the work that we've done, in addition to, and it's, bringing all that together, I think, is a cause for optimism. So yeah, cooperation.
Thanks, Lucy. And I should say you can dissent from my asserted optimism. You can tell me that's not the case. Alex?
I'm relentlessly and always optimistic, so I never need any invitation there. First of all, I'd say that we have, the thing to be optimistic is we have a public that have shown that they are receptive to these ideas. Now, that's not to say they always are. However, if we're persuasive in which we engage with people, we can build public support around these ideas. So that, I think, is a really good thing and a real positive and powerful thing. But I think I'd conclude by, I think as the elected representative around the table, perhaps I would always say this, and I certainly get told by my local members that I'm too obsessed with this. But you can, if it sometimes feels like a slow struggle to change things, and goodness knows it does, that can get really quick if you start winning elections again. And, obviously the US is a good example for this. If you had 4 years of your head in your hands in the US about public policy, then that changed pretty quickly. Now, that's not to say out of Joe Biden, you're going to get everything you wanted. However, the sheer act of that wonderful and peaceful transition of power, though perhaps not as much as we used to, that makes all the difference. And, that's not to say that you abandon everything in pursuit of that, but that at least, I would say you always have that end goal in sight. because if you can come around, not only get to, your high-minded principles and ideals, not only be, right on and on the argument, but if you can persuade people too, then that's how you open the doors to make real, substantial, lasting change. And that is out there, and that is for us. We just have to grab it. And certainly on the left, we are the worst at that. However, we have to change. So that's the reason for optimism. Not only can it be done, it's not that far away from us being able to do it.
Thanks, Alex. And finally, Emily.
Thank you. I think COVID, the scope of political imagination that gets widened because of COVID and what it's seen, changes coming in and decisions about income and things like that. I think that is a cause for optimism if we can hold to it. And also, especially because it undermines this very pernicious thing that everything is how it is because it's somehow just like that. It's just of nature like that. And everything is a personal and institutional and collective decision in reality, and we can change it. I think the second thing, which it is a cause for optimism, we've got a long way to go, is about listening to the right voices on this. So the whole story of the modern slavery story is about failure to listen to the voices of people who are being exploited or at risk of being exploited or are in situations in economies and societies where we would cast them as vulnerable, right? And part of this, I think, coming back to that colonialism question, is born of an assumption of people's ignorance. It's like if you're poor, or in particular spaces in the economy, you must just be like ignorant about the risks that are there. And that's why I think Peter's work is like groundbreaking and very important and very applicable to things happening in the UK today as well. So when we start listening to people, we realize that the problem is a lack of options, right? And that's why the dedication of my book is to all those who should have better options. And then we can start having a proper conversation about how we actually solve that. And I'm starting to see that listening happen. So there's like a great organization in the UK that started called Survivor Alliance, which is to ensure that people who've come out of exploitation are heard. More and more civil society organizations are realizing it's not okay to design policy without talking to the people that it's meant to benefit. And companies are behind the curve on this. There are too many companies telling me that they're doing modern slavery audits that don't involve speaking to workers, but there is progress on that. There are some better practices happening here and there. So I think for me, it's about stopping silencing people's voices and making sure we're centering those who know best, who are experts by experience.
Thanks, Emily. And I think that's a really important message to end on. So that leaves it to me just to say thank you very much to all of our panelists, to Emily, Lucy, Peter and Alex. Thank you to all of you for your questions. I'm really sorry we didn't manage to get to all of them, but really fantastic questions there. Please do look up the reports that we put in the chat, but also Emily's book. And remember, you can get 30% off with the IPPR 30 code from Pluto Press. But that's all from us. So thanks very much for joining us.